coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
And I think, the reason why Americans should care about this and should want to support crypto and get involved is because your currency is ultimately only as good as your culture. And if your culture is producing nothing of value, then your currency is going to become corrupted and debased inherently, and it's going to lose what authority it has. And so if we don't seize this opportunity to use this financial system as a way to create and value our culture that we produce and consume and share amongst ourselves, then we could find ourselves in a situation where, increasingly we're not really invited to create culture and share it amongst ourselves.
Hello, and welcome to the Roundtable, the official weekly podcast of the American Mind editors and publisher. Those of you who are regular listeners will at this point be asking, how long, oh Lord, how long? Because once again, our faithful host, Ryan Williams, president and publisher, is out. It's for good reason, I promise you, but it means you're stuck with me for one more round. I'm Spencer Clavin. I'm the features editor here at the American Mind. I'm joined today, as always, by managing editor Seth Barron, founding editor Matthew Peterson, and executive editor James Poulos. We have a bunch of, I think, really fascinating topics today, and we're going to start with this Wall Street Journal piece that's been making the rounds on the internet. The headline, if you want to look it up, is called "If You Sell a House These Days, the Buyer Might Be a Pension Fund." And it's identifying this kind of shocking trend. It focuses on a firm called BlackRock, which, if you haven't heard of that before or what it is, we'll get into that shortly. But BlackRock's not the only firm that's involved in this. Just corporations, companies buying up private homes and then renting them. The consequence of which is that the sort of traditional engine of financial advancement, of sort of moving up through the middle class and beyond the middle class, all of that is being undermined by these homes that go on the market in residential areas and are instantly snapped up, sometimes for even as much as $1 million over asking. I mean, of course, companies are able to outbid private individuals in almost every case, if not in every case. And in those cases where that's not true, then you're not dealing with somebody in the middle class. And so this is a huge concern. There was a remarkable thread by Cultural Husbandry on Twitter. This is a pseudonymous account at a philosophi. And I think this fellow is going to write for us at the American Mind, so watch out for that too. But he begins, he says, BlackRock is buying every single family house they can find, paying 20 to 50% above asking price and outbidding normal home buyers. Why are corporations, pension funds, and property investment groups buying entire neighborhoods out from under the middle class? Let's take a look. And this is a long thread, so I'm going to sort of skip around. But he says, who is BlackRock? Only the world's largest asset manager and the leading proponent of the Great Reset. This is the World Economic Forum, kind of Davos, Klaus Schwab. It was called a conspiracy theory, except that it was fully on their website. If you remember that notorious video that went around, in the future, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, right? This kind of bloodless global elite idea that we're going to deconstruct, use the pandemic and use sort of all the chaos of 2020 as opportunity. Never let a crisis go to waste, an opportunity to restructure society along lines that our betters, so-called, and so self-appointed, have determined are more morally virtuous, like not owning property. And so Cultural Husbandry goes on, they're looking to redistribute, get this, $120 trillion, and this is backed up with links, the entire wealth of the world's middle class and poor combined several times over. This is wealth redistribution, and it ain't rich people's wealth that's getting redistributed. It's normal American middle class, salt of the earth wealth heading into the hands of the world's most powerful entities and individuals, the traditional financial vehicle gone forever. And this is a Federal Reserve funded financial institution buying up all the houses to make sure that young families can't build wealth, that you're trapped as a renter forever. I am riveted by this. I'm obviously myself looking at buying a house. I know a lot of people who are in the same boat, late 20s, early 30s, and it's already incredibly difficult to do this in a lot of cities. It's getting harder and harder. And as this fellow on Twitter points out, it's the way that people used to sort of aspire and work toward financial mobility. And that, along with that comes socioeconomic mobility and all this other stuff. So gents, I'm really interested in your opinion on this and in your, especially, ideas about how people listening to this podcast, folks who maybe are not in positions of political power, how they and we can respond.
Well, I mean, I just bought a house. The good news is it's probably gone up 10% in value since I purchased it. I thought that was a really good thread, and it gets at the heart of the matter. It's a great example because it's so alarming, but this is going on in so many facets of the economy and American life. And if you read the original article, I mean, it's talking about an entire neighborhood being built and put up for bid. I think it's 124 homes. And
in Texas, right?
In Texas, and selling for really 50% more than what you would usually get from individuals. So, I mean, you're looking at a long-term play where instead of having your feudal lord be the bank, you now also have no house, and you have new feudal lords have entered the market, right? And, just the thought of a young couple going out, trying to buy a house and competing with BlackRock is absolutely insane. And there's so many parts to this that are important. I mean, one is, I don't think most people can comprehend the conglomerated power, right, of these kinds of entities and what they're doing worldwide. They hold the money of the people, hold the money of the people, hold the money. I mean, this is really, really incredible what has metastasized over the last 30 years. And I don't think most people really have a sense. I mean, the left has become the party of the wealthy, so they haven't really given people ways to visualize this easily, the kind of power of a firm this large. And I mean, this is a new concept. People have been doing this for a while, but it just strikes me as, well, I put it this way, the alarm that you can sense in that tweet thread, I think, just strikes me as justified. Because when you see Bill Gates buying up land, right, when you see multiple firms now going into housing, you're taking away the normal free space that we used to have. And a home is important in so many different ways. And I mean, this is a real threat. And it's the only, I mean, if you play this out, like imagine this starts happening, cost of single family is going to go up. Obviously, there'll be enormous pressure to build, but of course, there's been enormous pressure to build in places like Southern California for decades, and mountains of regulations and other forces, stave it off, right? They pretend like there's not enough open space in California. So that pressure won't go anywhere in blue states. What I could see happening, and the accelerationist in me is finding these white pills and silver linings every day now. If you imagine this going forward, what you would end up doing is putting a lot of pressure on red states to actually open things up and build way more single family, because they're going to have even more people, getting the hell out of the places where now it'll be, even harder to buy. And I think it's going to be hard. They can talk about the psyop of, you'll own nothing and be happy. I just think, that's going to take an enormous leap in America that still has a memory of a boomer past, and a home and buying a home is still something people want naturally. So I think you're going to have a lot of people then who will, the Great Migration will accelerate. And then you'd have a lot of good pressure within red states to say, let's drop all this ridiculous housing policy nonsense that's created all these monstrosities anyway. Let's look for ways in which we can allow people to sort of digitally homestead and allow them to buy houses. So that could be good. Sorting the country really at this point, I think, is good. So, okay, bring it on. I guess what floors me, and it will be very interesting to watch, is the reaction to this should be very strong, right? I mean, the red states should be saying, what in the hell is this? And a colleague of mine, a friend of ours, he had some good ideas today saying they should start with regulation and take money from entities that own too much or are too large that are doing this. And there's all kinds of ways to make it not worth their while. I don't know how you could want to live in a society in which corporations this big are becoming additional landlords, right, on top of the banks.
This situation highlights a certain tension in the rule of law, and one that if the tension is stretched tight enough can have implications at the very most fundamental level of politics that we experience in our everyday lives. So we can talk about Bitcoin later and how it has to do with changes in our financial system potentially. But there was some TV spot that everyone's favorite TV guest Ron Paul was on. I think like the last week or maybe the week before, and he was talking about Bitcoin and what the federal government might want to do to it or with it. And he said something funny, which was, "You can't tax money." And that seems sort of paradoxical, but then, you think about a world in which you own nothing but you're happy. Well, like money is a thing that you can possibly own. And there's a question about whether we live in a country where ownable assets are considered to have intrinsic value. And one example might be gold, and another example might be property, land, water, things of that nature. And money is not such a thing. And so there are those out there who say, like, well, ultimately, the state is the creator of all wealth because the state has a monopoly on money, and the state issues and controls money. And so even when you have that money sitting in your account, it's really not yours, insofar as you can't own money that is issued to you by a government. And so when we look at like large financial corporations, financial services entities, investment banks gobbling up huge tracts of a kind of property that has traditionally been relatively dispersed throughout the population, it puts pressure on the fact that, for most Americans, I think, owning your house is just a legal fiction. Like, you don't own it. You own maybe 10% of it. You own a 10% stake in a property that is owned by a bank. And the bank is probably one of those banks that would have gone under, but for all of the bailouts that happened after the financial crisis. And so, for decades now, we've been working on a financial system in which almost nobody really owns what they, as a legal fiction, purport to own or are considered as a legal matter to own. And if we keep pushing in that direction, there's going to be a pushback among people who don't want to live in a world where they can't own anything anymore. And one of the areas in which they're going to push back is on finance itself. People are going to say, well, hell, we can just come up with our own money and use that. And some of that's already started to happen with cryptocurrency. And what we're looking at right now is a government that is prepared to say, well, no, you can't really own that either. That would be a step toward a system that is so financialized and so captive to the regime that, it's getting hard to understand how our form of government would be compatible with a financial system like that.
Yeah.
Well, that's real.
No, go ahead, Seth.
Well, it's very interesting because Cuomo, I think just yesterday, Andrew Cuomo said that I think he wants to put some kind of moratorium on Bitcoin mining in New York on the grounds that it's too environmentally harmful, like it uses too much electricity. And I've heard this coming up from people on I don't know if you call it the left. Yeah, I guess the left. This is the argument against crypto, that it's environmentally unsustainable, and maybe they have a point. I mean, I don't know. It certainly does use a lot of energy, though I guess you pay for it. What's interesting about this whole housing thing is, BlackRock, Larry Fink is like a huge Biden guy, like a huge Democratic. Larry Fink's the founder and CEO of BlackRock. Now, the left for a long time, I mean, this is like one of the things that they loathe is the fact that school systems across the country are funded by property tax, which is assessed locally. And, they see this as, they'll say right out, this is essentially a legacy of racism. Schools, sewers, so many things are funded this way that, what they would prefer is to have, like what we have in New York City, where the whole school system, it's not funded neighborhood by neighborhood. Every school gets an allowance, based on a formula. The left wants to completely overturn local zoning and the local system of property tax. They would like to federalize zoning. In California, we saw this with that bill that Scott Wiener was pushing to. You hear this in a lot of places, Washington State, Minneapolis. They want to eliminate single-family zoning. You can still build a single-family house if you want to, but it'll be much more expensive because of the opportunity cost, because now it's possible to build like a quadruplex or an eightplex. The YIMBYist left, the yes in my backyard left, sees this as key to the whole project of destroying racial inequity, destroying white supremacy, destroying the legacy of of suburbs, the suburbanization of America. Joel Kotkin talks about this a lot. What they want to see is everyone living in highly dense metropolises, very few cars, very little private home ownership. And it's interesting. I wonder. This BlackRock move kind of seems like it dovetails somehow with this effort towards the federalization, the nationalization of local zoning, and this resistance to it, this hatred of people, just regular people owning something. It's this war on the kulak. The kulak in 1930s Soviet Russia was like the wealthy peasant. So the guy who has like a plumbing supply company and employs 10 or 15 people and owns a couple of nice trucks and has a swimming pool and a boat, that guy is like the enemy. He's the real enemy. And that's what they're trying to wipe out.
Right, because he's not wealthy enough to be sort of in the know about all the elite pieties, or to have swallowed whole the elite pieties. He probably still loves his country and has an attachment to his place, but he is wealthy enough, the kulak is, to actually assert those values. So unlike the kind of dirt poor or worse, terribly afflicted by addiction, these really rural towns that can be kind of written off and dismissed, the kulak and the upper middle class or just middle class guy is dangerous because he actually has wealth to throw around and to assert in some small region his own values against the values of the regime, of the ruling class, of the global elite. I'm reminded, as we're talking about dekulakization and sort of invoking the violence and that specter. I'm reminded of back in the summer of riots and the 1619 riots in summer 2020. One of the most shocking statements to come out of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the 1619 Project, and thus the kind of co-conspirator of the 1619 riots, said, and it made the rounds at the time, violence is when an agent of the state kneels on a man's neck until all of the life is leached out of his body. Destroying property which can be replaced is not violence. To use the same language to describe those two things is not moral. So this was in defense of the rioters and looters who were burning down American cities. And this, in turn, kind of at least made me reflect on the fact that actually, to Matt's point about how deeply rooted this sense is in the American soul, in the soul of your average red-blooded American, that in fact, destroying property is violence. I kind of went back at that time to Madison's essay on property, which is kicked off by this disagreement with William Blackstone, the British jurist, And the disagreement hinges on precisely this, that your ownership of your property operates according to the exact same principle as your ownership of yourself, your opinions, your religion, your just the fundamental right to do what you want with what is yours is very deeply associated, I think, in, as it were, the American mind, and rightly associated with your right to own actual stuff and actual property, and you know, having some concrete way to take ownership of that in the manner that James describes and that we will discuss further. I think, I mean, I hope at least that people will not go gently into that idea, which is fundamentally at base an inherently violent idea. It's inherently violent to say you have no right to ownership of stuff, because it carries with it all of the, ultimately, a denial of all rights, the right to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. I mean, this is like a remarkably hostile thing to say to somebody, that you shouldn't own a home, and you know, whether wittingly or not, and at various levels of this endeavor. I think it's at various levels of consciousness. You know, at the Klaus Schwab level, it's probably more explicit than at the level Seth's describing of kind of garden variety prog leftists. But at every level, it is an inherently hostile and aggressive thing to say to the American middle class that you don't have a right to own things, because ultimately what it means is you don't have a right to exist.
Well, and let's complete the logical step and say that destruction is worse than violence. I'd rather be beaten with reeds for an hour than have someone burn down my house. You know, I'd rather be dragged behind my house and beaten and abused than wake up and see that my house is in fact not my house, and everything in my house is in fact not mine, and maybe it's not even there anymore. You know, that is an act of destruction. It is a destruction of a property of a person. And people have properties that are not just properties in land and properties in material things. I mean, this is just straight out of James Madison. Like, we have all manner of properties and all manner of things. That's how there can be intellectual property. And to say that, like, well, you know, property isn't a thing that can be done violence to is bad enough. But to say that the destruction of property is in fact not violence is doubly wrong, because that kind of destruction is worse than mere violence, and even violence done unto a person.
Yeah, you are invoking for me here the heart-rending videos of, in many cases, minorities, people weeping over the destruction of their property in a way that, you know, they might not have over, as you say, like, there are degrees of violence, and not every kind of physical violence is greater in degree than every kind of property violence. Maybe, in fact, then let's move this next topic up. We were going to discuss this at the end, but I think it's a nice segue to raise more explicitly the developments to which you allude, James, about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. James brought to our attention this news story from which you can find on CoinDesk.com. Headline: IRS wants $32 million in funding to enforce crypto taxation and hire contractors. And so it's what it says on the tin. You know, this is an effort by the IRS to radically expand the infrastructure and the resources whereby it accounts for people's wealth in cryptocurrency and levies taxes upon that wealth. U.S. President Joe Biden plans to inject $80 billion into the IRS over the next 10 years to expand the agency's enforcement staff and equip them with new tools to fight against tax dollars. And so essentially, again, a metaphor I'm borrowing from James, it seems the eye of Sauron is aware that there's this thing called cryptocurrency, and a lot of people, not all of them the right kind of people, seem to be buying it and wielding it. And this was, I think, you know, it's useful maybe to invoke here a sort of analogous movement to the cryptocurrency movement, which was the kind of uprising, the GameStop gate, right? When everybody was shorting GameStop in a move performed every day by financial elites, but suddenly it was, you know, dangerous white supremacy when it was people on Reddit kind of like making money off of gaming the stock market. This is something that just seems to draw immense ire from the ruling class. Cryptocurrency seems now to be drawing that ire and more sustained efforts to devote resources and attention to figuring out how to head it off. But I know James has more to say on this, so I'll hand it over to you.
Well, right. So the Biden administration wants to spend $80 billion more on the IRS, everyone's favorite branch of the federal government, mostly just to do, to do what it says on the tin, as you say, which is to wring money out of people, even if they try to make an effort to not be completely at the mercy of the IRS. Of course, this is an IRS that works in a financial system where if you achieve a certain amount of super wealth and you are an entity and not an individual, then you are more or less free to go about your business without having to worry about onerous taxation. So, not only is this a financial system that is too onerous in the burdens that it places on people, but it actually rewards people for not functioning as individual proprietors and not organizing their personal economic life around families and communities and neighborhoods, but really selling it off to a handful of the world's largest and most powerful corporations. And so, that's the backdrop against which we have to look at what is going on with the IRS's request. Fortunately, we still live in a country where this is, for now, a request to Congress to grant them the authority to tighten up and extend their regulatory regime. I mean, the question is, what is it that they're trying to regulate? What is cryptocurrency after all? And I would draw attention to the fact that it's right there in the name. At the end of the day, cryptocurrency is a tool, a technological tool that uses secrets to create value. So basically, I have a computer, you have a computer. Our computers generate through cryptocurrency strings of numbers. These numbers are secret. There are secrets. Our computers exchange secrets. And on that basis, they can prove to one another that we are who we purport to be, even if our identities are not public. And therefore, there is enough of a trustable relationship being made that you can do things like write contracts that are enforceable in court, among other things. And so really, this is the government trying to say to people, you cannot come up with secret strings of numbers and share them with each other as you wish, which, is like a bizarre claim. Like, why would a government, on what basis would a government in a free society or under a Republican form of government behave in this way? And I think the answer is twofold. One is the government feels threatened by this. There are some, if you're seeing like a state, there are some reasonable concerns. Oh no, the dollar is the world reserve currency, and a lot of countries in the world would just as soon not have the dollar as their reserve currency. And so, maybe even the slightest tremor in that system could be, a butterfly flaps its wings in Wyoming and, China divests itself of all dollar-denominated debt, right? Like, that's a potentially nightmare scenario. And if you sit in the government all day or sit in a bureaucracy and you worry about these things, it's obvious why you would worry about something like that. There's another concern, though, which is, well, people are going to use this system to exit our system. And that, I think, goes more to the root of the issue, because it's really not about avoiding paying taxes at the end of the day. The threat is not like, John Doe moved a lot of money into crypto and now we're unable to get, our $12,000 a year out of him. I think what the feds don't want is they don't want people setting up parallel financial institutions. And this speaks to the relationship between the government and the financial system, the big banks. Even to the degree that a country like El Salvador becomes the first country in the world to say, hey, we're going to allow the use of Bitcoin as currency, as legal tender. And for obvious reasons, a lot of crypto people are hailing this as a historic event. And to that degree, it is. But when you look at, who's helping them do this? It turns out to be a young man with a company called Strike, who's been active in the crypto space since he was, 19 years old. And I'm just reading this from an interview that he did in 2018 when he was, I think, 18 years old, maybe a little bit older. Yeah, I guess he'd have to be about 21. Here we go. 24. You're only 24 years old. And this is, what's his name? Jack Mallers is the guy whose company is helping El Salvador sort of figure out how to do crypto. You're only 24 years old, asked the interviewer, may we ask you how you discovered blockchain technology and how you came to be so active in the crypto space? And here's what he says. I got involved in the space because of my father. My Bitcoin story involves a cheat code. My father is the smartest man I've ever met, and he got me into Bitcoin when I was 19. My family has a lot of history in finance. My grandfather was the youngest chairman of the Chicago Board of Trade and signed the funding check for the Chicago Board Options Exchange. My dad founded and ran a futures brokerage in Chicago. Here's the important part. A lot of Chicago finance has been watching Bitcoin closely for a long time. He recognized Bitcoin as a new asset class, which Goldman Sachs just did this year, and started getting my stepmom and I involved around a year after I graduated high school. Okay, so even at the level of what appears to be, big changes in the financial system coming out of crypto, you've got major players in finance who have been watching this for a long time and who want to be sure that cryptocurrency is not used by ordinary Americans to create parallel financial institutions, but is folded into the financial system that we have, the financialized economy that we have, and it becomes no more than an asset class, yet another asset class, another basket of goods that goes right into the same investment system and banking system that everything else goes into. Now, if you go back and you look at Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper that got all of this kicked off, that Satoshi's depiction of what cryptocurrency is, what Bitcoin is a depiction of a mode of exchange, a form of person-to-person, peer-to-peer currency. And that's not what our financial system has in store for crypto. And for a lot of Americans, this is like, wait a minute, what's going on? Like, I just got out of lockdown. Like, I don't know what the hell is going on. I know it's a steep learning curve, but when you drill down to it, I think the stakes are very high, and you don't need to know all the details inside and out. You don't need to become a nerd in order to orient yourself in this space. Pretty basic things, and increasingly stark choices between a system of creating culture and valuing it on our own amongst ourselves freely, independently, and collaboratively, versus a much different system that looks a lot more like the one the WEF is trying to sell.
So I'm what counts as, I think, like a noob on this stuff. I'm a total ignoramus about cryptocurrency and NFTs. I know just enough about it to sort of follow along, James, in what you're saying. But it does strike me that there is sort of fundamentally in this, as you say, right? If this whole thing is predicated on people sharing freely with one another secret chains of numbers, and I'm vastly oversimplifying, I realize, then there is a question, right? As you say, if you're seeing like a state, there is a question on the table: how are we going to regard this form of wealth? And one question I have is, what does it mean to accept cryptocurrency as legal tender? I mean, you mentioned this. Would this be akin to sort of letting Bitcoin be on a par with the dollar in American business negotiations? And are there actual concerns about that a non-crazy administration could raise?
Well, so the easy answer is, for example, you could pay your taxes in Bitcoin in El Salvador. That would be an example of, okay, this is something that you can use in the same way that you would use the currency issued by the government and stamped at the mint and disseminated into and through the banking system. But you're right that there are many questions, and there are many questions because there are many potential answers. And so if you really want to go down the crypto rabbit hole, what you will discover is that there are many different kinds of coins. There are the ones that you've heard about on the news. There are obscure coins that are sometimes referred to as coin because of how very, very low indeed their value is. They're kind of vanity projects or sort of elaborate jokes. And the most successful of these is Dogecoin, which now many people, I guess, have heard about, courtesy of Elon Musk.
I was just noting, remarkably, that for the first time, for my first time being on CoinDesk, it's been a while since I was on this site, but they have a kind of like a stock exchange, up at the top, just the major currencies, and Dogecoin is there now as one of the currencies whose value is listed. I don't think that was the case maybe half a year ago.
It is not, and I remain curious as to whether Elon Musk is so interested in Doge, not just for its sort of meme power, although there's obviously something to that, but so that he can somehow acquire it or control it and use it as the only form of payment that he will accept for tickets to Mars. That is my speculation. We will see if it pays out. But yes, Doge has been listed. Getting listed on these exchanges is a big deal for cryptocurrency. But just to close the loop on the point I was groping toward earlier, you will find, if you go down the rabbit hole, that there are cryptocurrencies that are pegged to certain assets. So these are known as stable coins. And so there's crypto that's pegged to the dollar, crypto that's pegged to the value of an ounce of gold, or even crypto that's pegged to like a basket of other assets or goods. And what's interesting about this is currencies issued by governments used to work in this way too. Of course, we used to be on the gold standard. There are other ways of doing this. You can really set these things up however you want, and you can even have like securities and other financial instruments pegged to the values of still more assets or instruments. And so in that respect, it is kind of turtles all the way down. And if you're looking for something that has intrinsic value, you have to ultimately look beyond currency to the kinds of things, whatever the substrate is that the currency, so to speak, is being stamped onto. So there are many ways to slice it, and that is because this is a type of exchange that does not need to be adjudicated in any particular way. 1,000 flowers really can bloom. And that in and of itself represents a sort of threat or challenge to people in finance who, for them, the ideal is one system, one perfected system that is comprehensive and total. And that's a world that ultimately, I think, reflects what Umberto Eco referred to as the search for perfect knowledge, or the search for the perfect language. Real Tower of Babel hours. The desire to create one form of perfected communication that permeates and suffuses all aspects of life to the exclusion of all others because it is perfect. I think if you're ever going to see something like that, it's going to come out of a world in which all of the computing devices, all the digital devices fuse into a single entity that is also an environment. I'm not advocating for that, but I think that when you really strip it down to why, so like the best case for sovereign states to be a little worried about crypto is that if it sort of falls into the wrong hands or the wrong sort of people get control of it, then it'll become the system that eats the world. Right.
I mean, that Musk prediction is actually, it sounds like a kind of like fun bet to take, but there's to me, I think a tremendously important point to it, which is there's a very real scenario. No idea if that's what Musk has in mind, what he's planning. Maybe he seems to just kind of enjoy surprising people with his tweets. But let's imagine that it is, right, totally plausible that would occur. Whereupon I assume the value of Dogecoin would rocket upward. But that's related to, as you suggest, right? As like all currency, ultimately it's related somewhere to some substratum that represents value to people. But not everybody wants to go to Mars. Not everybody cares about cryptocurrency. And so there would be like an actual sort of organic link between how much Dogecoin is worth to people and what it's worth that for, right? I mean, this is, again, speaking as an ignoramus here, but it seems to me as if that like one of the things that makes people antsy if what they want is one world order, as we were talking about on the previous segment, is precisely this kind of scrappy Wild West organic reality of like actual people making actual decisions about things that they actually want. And one, talk about the gold standard, right? One potential substratum that I have not heard discussed, at least yet in this conversation, that I wanted to ask your opinion about, James, or anybody else that wants to chime in, is like one resource that was a big deal when big tech was cracking down on people like Parler, was suddenly server space. Suddenly I and others became aware that these are actual computers somewhere and people control those computers and they can then control what goes on the internet, right? Are there efforts to link Bitcoin value to that kind of resource? I mean, it seems like the most natural analog for the gold standard would be like server space or something. And then you would be in a position really of trying to control one of the most valuable resources and one of the most unregulated resources currently on the market.
Well, that's. I'll just make one more point really quickly, and then I'll go to mute. The etymological root of the word cloud is clod of dirt, like heap of soil, a mountain, and sure enough, like the cloud is servers underground. So this is why people care about sort of energy outputs and everything, because it's the compute that you need to mine the Bitcoin that allows you to get it without having to create anything else. And I think, the reason why Americans should care about this and should want to support crypto and get involved is because your currency is ultimately only as good as your culture. And if your culture is producing nothing of value, then your currency is going to become corrupted and debased inherently, and it's going to lose what authority it has. And so if we don't seize this opportunity to use this financial system as a way to create and value our culture that we produce and consume and share amongst ourselves, then we could find ourselves in a situation where, increasingly we're not really invited to create culture and share it amongst ourselves.
I'm just wondering, just to poke a little bit of contrarianness into the conversation. I fail to see how Bitcoin can exist outside of securitization. To me, it does seem like just another security. There's all kinds of derivatives that are traded in the financial markets that reflect and reflect and reflect. They're completely refracted, as we saw with the credit default swaps in 2008. Bets on options, bets on the direction or the acceleration of options, very kind of obscure, arcane stuff. So in a sense, how is Bitcoin? Right now, except in very limited circumstances, like it's not like much is transacted in Bitcoin. Its entire value is the fact that it's what it's denominated in dollars. Like, can you exchange Bitcoin for dollars? It's kind of like with GameStop, all those people like, I will hold GameStop until my dying day. It's like, well, why? It's like having like a treasure chest full of gold on a desert island. Like, what are you going to do with it? So and also it's not entirely clear to me. I think that people are very optimistic about this idea that somehow Bitcoin can be exempt from the clutches of government. I'm not so sure. Like, say Elon Musk decided to make his Mars trips, denominated only in Dogecoin. Well, the government could say, okay, well, you're no longer allowed to fly to Mars. That's the government is taking that over. But also, like, they've already, like with this ransomware thing, they cracked the Bitcoin code on it and seized the Bitcoin back from the kidnappers. I'm just not so sure that if they wanted to, couldn't they shut it down? It seems unlikely to me that this could actually exist totally independently of the financial system or the existing systems of surveillance, power, control, finance, etc. That's all.
I see Matt moving his eyebrows around.
No, I think it's good contrarianness. I don't know, but you want to respond to some of that?
Well, yeah, I think that these are the questions, and the idea is not, at least to my mind, to. We can go back to like Mark Andreessen had an interview recently with the irascible Niccolo Soldo, whose interviews are fairly amusing. He interviewed me a while back. That's not the reason why I'm plugging them. There's other interesting stuff in there. So Andreessen, like in the early COVID era, released this kind of statement, like sort of a manifesto, really, like it's time to build, and made a splash and sort of said true things about stagnation and sort of decadence and capital kind of losing its way and just sitting there and like, what are we doing? And it's time to build. And yet there was this sort of lingering question of, well, build what? Like build like Gothic cathedrals, build like McDonald's franchises, like what should we build? And he kind of didn't like address that full on until this little interview with Niccolo. And he basically said, like, look, reality is overrated. 5,000 years, it really hasn't shown the ability to make everyone generally happy, or like even most people like fairly happy. Reality seems to be like perpetually disappointing when it comes to like thriving. And so what we should build are like more virtual worlds, because actually in virtual worlds, people can sort of be themselves a little bit more freely and productively, and it gives them room to breathe. And so there is a sort of mental model of cryptocurrency, which is, hey, this is this cool virtual world where we sort of find a way to escape from, the troubles of reality and the messiness of politics and like the problem of having governments. I'm not attributing all that to Mark, but I am saying that like there is this sort of corner of like libertarian world where those kinds of thoughts are very natural and very welcome. That's not really what I'm driving at. Because, trying to exit reality completely is, from my standpoint, like a doomed enterprise, and one that is not just sort of like, well, it has some costs and benefits. Like, no, you do want to remain primarily rooted in reality, even if you are sort of participating in technologies that collapse space-time, which is really what digital technology is doing at this point. Because if you just leave that alone to the robots will be unsupervised. God knows what they'll get up to. We have to engage to some degree. So it's really not, cryptocurrency from my standpoint isn't an opportunity to do the equivalent of flying to Mars, which is like get in this technological spaceship and fly into the void and like laugh at those Earthlings for being stuck in reality. Because it's true that it's very difficult to build a parallel institution of any kind that comes completely unglued from its origins. And so, I think the question is not like whether government can or can't have some control over cryptocurrencies, but like which government, like government at which level, and like what is the appropriate level of government and what is the appropriate structure or form of government that does have that kind of control. This is in its easiest form, I think, expressible as just like a version of federalism, or, if you're Catholic, a version of like distributivism, where it's like, well, if you can solve a problem at the lowest, there's some lowest level at which every problem can be solved. And so there should be a kind of bias or disposition in favor of letting problems be solved at the lowest possible level. That's like Catholic social teaching, more or less. The sort of Protestant / kind of post-Protestant constitutional tradition has its own sort of federalist take on that sort of stuff. Orthodox countries have kind of approached the question of distributing power in their own kind of way, with still having basically like national churches as their form of theological hierarchy. So there are different ways of doing this, and I think governance and Bitcoin are going to be in a relationship, and the question is what kind of relationship and who's going to sort it out and how it's going to work. And these should be, and I think they are, like exciting questions that pertain to how we need to sort of get America back on its feet in a way, in good stead for a digital age.
Well, these conversations to me are just so dynamic and exciting, and dare I even say hopeful, in the sense that they actually address the radical changes that are going on around us at a digital level, and pose to us a number of ways forward that don't look like anything I've ever seen before. And yet, as James is saying, you can sort of feel your way out to something that might even indeed look American and might carry the American way of life forward into the 21st century. Not so for our last quick topic, which I just thought was, it's kind, in some ways it's sort of a lighter item because of what a clown car our current administration is. But we wanted to touch on this Kamala Harris address in Guatemala. It was a couple days ago. She's gone on this sort of diplomatic mission into Central America, and she makes this this speech, which, I mean, my goodness, it's like she did all but say build the wall. I'll just read a couple passages of it, and then I'll mention something that people aren't saying in the write-up, or aren't recording in the write-up. The goal of our work, says Harris, is to help Guatemalans find hope at home. At the same time, I want to be clear to folks in the region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back. She goes on to say, we are going to enforce our laws, all of this stuff. I mean, were this speech happening in a vacuum, it would almost be reason for applause, except that, of course, we know that this woman and this administration do nothing out of interest for the American people, and basically everything out of interest for themselves and their cronies. I wanted to mention, just as an amusing note in passing, that a portion that is not being reported on from this speech, but I know I heard it, so you can look it up. And I've also found a couple places where this occurs in White House remarks from March, which are online. Harris repeatedly uses the term coyote to refer to somebody who illegally smuggles people across the border. I just want to read one headline among innumerably many this is from 2018, December 21st. Does Trump think there are actual coyotes coming over the border? This was a time when, on the basis of absolutely nothing, the mere use of the word coyote, to say everybody would be understating it. I mean, this, like, every official news source, every Instagram post, everywhere you looked, there was this insistence that, oh, Trump thinks there are real coyotes, like canine coyotes carrying children across the border. The Trump quote involved, every year 50,000 illegal children are smuggled by coyotes and criminals into our country. That was enough Trump is stupid, Trump is racist, Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. After spouting off, this is Vox, after spouting off some factually dubious claims about immigration and border security, Trump suggested that he thinks the real issue is coyotes at the border, the actual animal. It's just unbelievable. Now, of course, this has always been a normal term. Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia. Coyote has always been a perfectly normal way to refer to this phenomenon. But the larger point here is I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on what internal memos are circulating. And this will be speculative, I know, but there have been a number of points at which it sort of feels like that moment when Don Lemon let slip on air that they needed to stop rioting. He needed to tell people to stop rioting because it was affecting the polls during the election. This idea that there's a kind of reality TV element of this, that like in real time they seem to be adjusting. I wonder whether the border crisis just got so bad that they sort of had to pivot to like a form of neo-Trumpism. I have to confess, it brings a slight smile to my face. And I wonder if you guys agree with me and whether you think there's some kind of internal conversation going on about having to walk some of the crazy stuff back.
Well, first, the hypocrisy is the point. I mean, it's almost, you read that speech just telling people not to come here. And I'm just dumbfounded. I mean, and for some reason, it's always Harris. She's like, people say Biden's a stooge. I mean, who's president, right? But Kamala has always been this awkward stooge of other people. It's almost like you find someone who you think you can actually use and manipulate to do your bidding, right? But they can't actually communicate well, or they can never do it right. And that's what she's like. She's never been able to really pull this off in a real way. And every part of that trip was just disastrous. Every part of it, it's not just cringe. I mean, it was actually just counterproductive and weird. And the only thing I can think, which is incompetence is too much in human life to even think this, but you almost think they wrote that speech just so people on the right would read it and tear their hair out, right? And to say like, no, actually, we can go to Guatemala and sound like Pat Buchanan and it's all cool. Of course, people shouldn't come here. Did every Democratic candidate sit on a stand and in front of the entire nation and say we should give free stuff to anyone who wants to jump over the border? Yes, they did. That in fact happened. But by the way, don't come here. You're going to get apprehended. Like the Guatemalans don't believe it. we don't believe it. And you listen to it and right, of course we can say coyote, of course we don't want people coming across the border. And it's a combination of things. One is that the narrative is just so thin. It's just, you look at it and go, I can't believe this is happening. But I do think that the reason it's happening with her and why she is interesting to watch, in a way, it's not just that speech. Harris has done a lot of normie things, right? She's done a lot of uniparty things. There seems to be some effort through her and Biden from the beginning to sound like, right, the kind of Mitt Romney uniparty Democrat. And that's the whole reason Biden won. It's the whole reason he's the perfect guy for them. He sounds like we're in normal political times, everything's going to be fine. It is certainly the case that people who are watching these things, even remotely closely, realize they have instigated a kind of backlash that's real. And there's a couple of signs of this, and we should just acknowledge this as a group, really. It's important. Multiple articles, right? You have the Washington Post and New York Times doing very in-depth debriefs on the results of the 2020 election. And especially the one on the New York Times about the counties across the country. What they showed was, and it was a warning to the Democrats, what they showed was that in counties where Biden won by quite a bit, that margin had dissipated. He still won by quite a bit, but with minority voters, it was slipping, right? The total ownage was slipping. This is, of course, very worrisome to the left. And there's been a number of articles saying, hey, even the minorities are leaving us. And, not in droves, but there's a shift and they sense it. There's a shift on our side as well. Dare I say it? There is really a hard change on the American right where the base is based and they're not going to stop. You're not going to, just like with Kavanaugh, right? It was a strengthening moment. Even people who weren't paying attention went, what the hell was that? After this, it will take years for this to dissipate. 70% of the Republican base sees what time it is, and they are, to varying extents, ready and willing to do something about it. So I think there's a real acknowledgement, if you're sitting there and you're not a lunatic zealot from the woke religion, right? But you are a billionaire, terrible person who's trying to destroy America and keep your wealth. You're looking around going, okay, we have to dial this back. And I've heard this from a number of people, who would actually be talking to those billionaires. There's a number of people who are, behind the scenes in kind of rhetorical power as well. And then you can just watch what's happening. And look, the interesting thing to me is they want to dial back the rhetoric. They won't change the radical policies, but they want to change the way it's framed. They realize that they pushed really hard. But, that's not all of them. And I don't know, they got the tiger by the tail. I don't really know if they can restrain much of this, right? You might buy BLM off and they get nice houses for a while, but you set something in motion, I'm not sure that they can stop. So that's kind of the dynamic I see right now. It's sort of a, okay, we need to be careful. We need to dial some of this back, right? But it's very unclear as to whether that's possible. And we're in this kind of doldrums of summer where, things are still very tense in all directions. But right now, I can see a lot of people sitting there going, yeah, Matt, that's right. That's what we're going to do. And everything's going to be fine. And we'll just roll on. I don't think that's possible, but that's what a lot of these kind of uniparty types are thinking.
Yeah, I'm kind of of two minds about that question of can they stop it with regards to whether they want to stop it. You're absolutely right, Matt. This stream of people flowing northward, which was openly encouraged on national television from before the election to thereafter. And people saying, Biden let me in, right? They're I joked about Harris sounding like a hawk on this, but this sort of bumbling woman going down south to say, do not come, that is not going to stem that tide. And part of me wonders, I guess, whether that was the intent all along. You get this stuff rolling as fast as you possibly can down the hill, and then you make some symbolic gesture that you want it to stop, right? But of course, at that point, you're powerless, and you've rendered yourself powerless in exactly this way for exactly this reason. Now, that may be giving Kamala Harris and Joe Biden too much credit, and there's always been a way on the modern left in which this is they're playing with this incredibly flammable material that is sort of social Marxism and its attendant ills, and they just don't know how to deal with that. They think they can ride that to the polls somewhere, and then it just sort of takes over. I guess I lean a little bit more in that direction, just because, as you indicate, Matt, Kamala Harris has, so far as I know, never done anything successfully in her life. She constantly zigs right when she should zig left. I mean, it's not as if this is the first time she's been a hard-nosed kind of uniparty type. She does that whenever she thinks it's politically expedient, and on some level, there's just no. I mean, there's no trusting somebody that has no principles, precisely for this reason, that there's just, you can sort of tell what they're going to do on the basis of how desperately they happen to be flailing about at this moment to pander for whatever particular vote. So I guess I'm kind of more in that camp, but there is part of me that wonders whether is the ineffectiveness of this part of the point.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that. The speech is just, it's one of these things so dumbfounding. I found a lot of times in life when something is just doesn't make any sense to you, often you shouldn't continue to pursue the cause, because the cause is a confluence of factors that are actually not something you can predict or comprehend. Like if you're dealing with some kind of sociopath or whatever, and people rack themselves like, well, why did this person do X, Y, and Z? Like, actually, you're better off not thinking about that. This is insanity or incompetence in a way that's very deep, and you can't like understand it. But certainly I would say like a lot of it, right, is these people have become so radicalized, or rather they've normalized in their own mind. It's totally normal to want to make sure that no one owns anything in the world. And that's a good thing, actually. They've gotten to that point. So I guess what I would say is, it's not that ideologically they're centrist. It's that if you're just pragmatic about it, you're looking around and going, okay, I think we pushed pretty much to the max here, right? We got to dial this back. And we're still going to move in the same direction, generally speaking, but we really need to dial some of this back, or change the rhetorical approach. We need some new PR. And so I would look for, and I think people are hip to this in our circles. I've seen people on Twitter talking about this, but I would definitely look for ways in which they reframe critical race, for instance, reframe the way they talk about immigration in a way that doesn't substantially change policy, but tries to change the way in which it's presented. And on both sides, I don't see that. I don't see that really working. There's a real danger here, though, and the reason we should, we are talking about it is because there's a sense among many Americans that's very normal, very natural, that says this is all such crazy, BS. Can't we just go back to normal? The concept of, can't things just be normal? And sometimes we want that so much that we retreat into a kind of denial about how not normal things are and how bad things are. And I'll give you one example. I was in a conversation with someone about totally unrelated matters to the culture wars, but about economic stuff. And this person was kind of repeating all these mantras from 1985 and kind of denying that there was an economic problem in the country, right? That, everything's fine, and it's not actually, the inequality problem is not actually huge, and everything's going to be okay. And I just went to the cultural problem of, obviously, having a society where this many kids are born out of wedlock is not healthy, right? And this person acknowledged that fact and said, no, that you're right, that is a problem. Then moved back into a state of denial about the economy. And I would just say that's normal. That's natural. Like, people do this. We don't want to acknowledge the craziness. And if you've ever dealt with a really toxic, insane individual, like someone who really is just kind of danger to themselves and others, you'll realize that this is kind of a principle. Like, you don't want to acknowledge that Uncle so-and-so actually now has schizophrenia, right? I mean, you don't want to acknowledge the bad stuff. And I feel like a lot of Americans are there. So the danger is that we and this is how things muddle on, and this happens often in political affairs. The danger is that the crisis talk actually does subside, right? It allows for all the things that these guys want. It allows for BlackRock to do what they want. And people kind of nod their heads, in the middle class and upper middle class, like, yeah, it's okay. Things are going back to normal. And they do that willfully. I don't think that's going to happen, because I think what's happening now is much deeper. The transition is upon us, but I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility. And I think for a lot of people who are in charge, that's what they want to happen.
Yeah, well, we will close with that reminder to stay alert. I mean, I the white pill for me that I take away from this conversation is the contrast between the two halves of it. I reflect upon the dynamism and the energy, and even, Matt, as you say, yes, of course, there are people who sort of want that complacency, want to go back to the 90s or the early 2000s and just watch Bennifer get together, and will sort of trick themselves into believing that that's a reality. But there is also just this enormous amount of energy and desire to find solutions. We just published today that feature on redrawing the lines. I guess when people hear this, it'll have been up for a day. But the creativity involved on the right, and the openness to a future that might not actually be completely disastrous, or into building that future. When you contrast it with the flailing ineptitude of the Biden administration and just the worn out emptiness of all their rhetoric, I find hope in that. And I hope that people listen to what Matt is saying about not letting the energy drop in that regard. Thank you once again for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our website at americanmind.org, claremont.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, our brand new Washington, D.C. based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And I always hasten to add our Substack, The American Mindset, at americanmind.substack.com. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a 5-star review, or at least keep your bad opinions to yourself. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee, and thank you all for listening. You make it worthwhile. Talk to you next week.